I had just changed my clothes in the dressing room and was about to leave when the bedroom door suddenly opened. The door of the dressing room is a one-way mirror, allowing me to clearly see everything happening in the bedroom. Nanny Emily Song opened the bedroom door and went straight to my dressing table, fiddling with my jewelry. I was about to go out and stop her when I saw my husband, David Lee, come in holding our child. I froze. David Lee was supposed to be on a business trip out of town. How could he possibly be at home? David Lee hurriedly rushed to Emily Song and took the ring she had already put on her finger. "Why are you messing with her things again? If she finds out, we're in trouble." Emily Song gave David Lee a resentful look. "You bought her so much jewelry, she won't even notice if one or two pieces are missing. Besides, why am I touching her jewelry? Isn't it because you only buy things for her and not for me?" Emily Song took the child from David Lee's arms, looking completely aggrieved. "I gave you a big, healthy son, and I got nothing in return. Every day, I have to watch my own son call another woman a mom. How miserable is that?" Emily Song's words were like a thunderbolt. I couldn't believe my ears. The nanny and my husband were not only having an affair, but they also had a child together. And this child is now my adopted son. It felt like a bucket of cold water was poured over my head, leaving my ears buzzing. My husband, his mistress, and their child were living happily right under my nose, while I had become an outsider in my own marriage. If I hadn't heard it with my own ears, I would never have imagined such absurdity could exist in this world. When it was quiet outside, I came out of the walk-in closet. Emily Song persistently pleaded with David Lee to buy her a proper piece of jewelry, and David Lee had no choice but to relent. I walked to the balcony and looked outside. David Lee was holding the child, with Emily Song snuggling against his arm. The glow of the sunset fell on them, casting long shadows. Anyone who saw them couldn't help but feel what a warm and beautiful family they were. But I am David Lee's lawful wife, with my name on the same marriage certificate. My husband betrayed me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down, recalling all the overlooked clues. I have always had poor health. When David Lee was pursuing me, I explicitly told him that I wouldn't be able to have children in the future. But to my surprise, David Lee not only didn't mind but was even more devoted to me. With a gentle spring breeze in his eyes, he looked at me and said, "I love you, and as long as it's you, everything is fine." Later, we dated and got married, and he indeed lived up to his words. No matter what others said, he never once argued with me over the issue of children. However, he would slow down when passing by a kindergarten and cast envious glances at families playing in the neighborhood playground. I saw all of this and knew he liked children. Because of this, I was even more grateful that he never mentioned the topic of children. Until last year, when David Lee's father fell seriously ill. I was on a business trip at the time, and when David Lee called me, his voice was trembling. He asked if we could have a child, so his father wouldn't leave with regrets. He said that even adopting would be fine. In all the years we had been together, this was the first time I saw David Lee cry. My heart softened, and I agreed to adopt a child with him. After that, David Lee took care of all the adoption matters. What did he say at the time? He said he was worried I'd be overwhelmed and wouldn't adapt to having a child suddenly, so he would handle everything. All I had to do was wait for a sweet baby to call me a mom. Looking back now, I realize what a complete fool I was. All his concerns about my well-being and adapting were lies. David Lee just needed an excuse to keep me out of the way so he could secretly be with Emily Song and then bring their child into our home. I was kept in the dark and even devoted myself to their child. In all honesty, I was definitely a qualified adoptive mother. Since I chose to adopt him, I felt responsible for this life. I did thorough research on everything the child needed, from formula to diapers, fearing that anything might fall short. My phone's notifications were filled with more and more mother and baby content, and the homepage of my shopping apps was mostly occupied by baby products. I wholeheartedly loved David Lee and diligently cared for this child who had no blood relation to me, only to be hit with this brutal truth. My fingers clenched so tightly they creaked, and the anger in my chest was uncontrollable. The husband I shared a bed with every night not only made me foolishly moved by his thoughtfulness, but also had me happily raising his and his mistress's child. How could such a thing happen in this world? In the evening, Emily Song came back with the child. Sure enough, she had a famous brand bracelet on her wrist. I took a sip of tea and casually remarked, "That's a nice bracelet. I don't recall seeing you wear it before." Emily Song twirled the bracelet and tried to hide it under her sleeve. This one? My husband just bought it for me recently. I thought I'd wear it today on a whim. Feigning surprise, I said, "Your husband can afford such an expensive bracelet for you, yet he lets you work so hard?" He just made a little money recently," Emily Song chuckled awkwardly. "Oh, it's time for the baby to sleep. I'll go wash up the child and bring him to your room, ma'am." Every action of Emily Song's seemed magnified in my eyes. Her unnatural smile and eagerness to change the subject clearly showed a guilty conscience. I couldn't be bothered to probe further, so I got up and went to my room. "I haven't been feeling well lately. The child will sleep with you tonight. From now on, you don't need to bring him to my room at night." To let the child experience motherly love, I had endured many sleepless nights, staying with the child despite the crying. Now, I realized it was pointless worrying. The child's biological mother was just a wall away in the nanny's room. There was no need to worry about the child lacking motherly love. I should just enjoy my beauty sleep. The next day, I woke up feeling refreshed, my mood slightly improved despite the disruptions from those scumbags. In contrast, Emily Song had dark circles under her eyes and looked exhausted. But compared to the harm I had suffered, what was this? So, I told Emily Song that I would be entertaining friends at home today and asked her to prepare. I chose all difficult dishes, and even the fruits for my friends were hard to prepare. Emily Song didn't leave the kitchen all morning. I invited many friends, so naturally, there were many dishes to wash. After the meal, Emily Song was busy in the kitchen for a long time, taking out trash several times before everything was finally cleaned up. Emily Song barely had a moment to catch her breath before the child woke up from the nap and needed attention. She couldn't help but frown but had to suppress her temper and comfort the child. I ignored her and continued chatting with my friends over tea. Emily Song walked around with the child several times, trying to catch my eye. How could I not understand her intentions? In the past, I thought as long as she took good care of the child, housework didn't matter, let alone cooking a big meal for guests. And whenever the child cried nonstop, I would personally comfort him. Emily Song had never been this tired before. She repeatedly brought the child out, but seeing no response from me, she finally called out to me. Of course, I wouldn't help her. I shrugged helplessly and said, "If a professional like you can't comfort him, what can I do?" Emily Song was speechless and had to take the child back quietly. In the evening, after everything was tidied up, Emily Song was exhausted. I leisurely finished the milk she heated for me with a face mask on, smiled, and told her that I had more friends coming tomorrow. Emily Song's face stiffened. "More friends tomorrow?" I looked at her innocently. "Of course, I have many friends." Every day thereafter, I invited a lot of friends over. Emily Song was so busy she could hardly drink a sip of water, looking more haggard each day. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Before bed, she brought the washed child to me, looking troubled. "Ma'am, ever since Lily has been sleeping with me, he's been crying all night. I'm afraid if this continues, he'll get sick from lack of sleep." Emily Song looked at me eagerly. "This child is so attached to you, ma'am. He can't be apart from you." I watched her lie to me without blushing or skipping a beat and coldly laughed inside. She said it so nicely, but wasn't it just to get me to take care of the child at night so she could sleep? Of course, I wouldn't indulge her. "Then you'll have to work harder at night," I said, and closed the door with a bang. Beauty sleep was more important. David Lee came back early from his business trip. As soon as he returned, he explained to me that large expense a few days ago was for a gift for a client. The client was so pleased that they signed the contract right away, so I came back early. "I missed you so much, wife. Look, I even brought you a gift," David Lee said, handing me a gift box. I used the excuse of looking at the gift to avoid his hug. Now I resist any contact with him. The gift David Lee gave me was a bracelet, the same brand as the one on Emily Song's wrist. My heart grew cold. David Lee had taken my trust and used it as his bargaining chip, even making his lies so perfunctory. The ridiculous thing is, I had never doubted him before, truly blinded by love. But now I've awakened, I don't believe a word he says. The business trip was a lie, and the client being happy and letting him come back early was nonsense. It was likely that Emily Song couldn't take my torment anymore and complained to him. David Lee quickly confirmed my suspicions. He started asking why I had so many friends over these past few days. What? Am I not allowed to have some social life? Of course not, it's just... David Lee looked troubled. We hired the nanny to take care of the child. Now Xiaomei is busy entertaining your friends, so it's hard for her to take care of the child. She's just a woman trying to make a living, it's not easy for her. Seeing David Lee defending Emily Song word by word, I suddenly felt this scene was familiar. About a month ago, I had an appointment but was stood up by a friend, so I had to turn back home. At the time, I was worried about disturbing the child's nap, so I opened the door carefully and walked quietly. When I opened the bedroom door to check if the child was sleeping well, I saw Emily Song holding the child, teaching him to call her a mom. I couldn't understand this behavior. Since I wasn't the child's biological mother, Emily Song's actions made me very uncomfortable. So, as soon as David Lee came home, I mentioned replacing the nanny. But I didn't expect David Lee to oppose me for once. He said Emily Song was just trying to provide the child with a sense of security, allowing the child to feel motherly love at all times, which was beneficial for their bond. He held me in his arms and teased me. My dear wife, are you too nervous being a first-time mom? Why make a fuss over such a small matter? I was so swayed by his sweet talk that I really started to reflect on whether I was overreacting. Later, I even gave Emily Song an extra month's salary as an apology. The more I recall the past, the more pathetic I feel. In reality, David Lee was still openly and secretly siding with Emily Song, making me even angrier. I pushed David Lee away and went to the nanny's room to find Emily Song. If you have any complaints, come to me directly. What's the point of complaining to my husband? Emily Song didn't expect me to confront her and stood there, stammering, unable to say anything. I coldly continued, we hired you to work. If you can't do it, pack your things and leave now. David Lee, who had followed me, saw me so furious for the first time and hurriedly tried to pull me away. Wife, you misunderstood. Emily Song isn't dissatisfied, she's just tired and mentioned it to me. As soon as David Lee arrived, Emily Song's eyes turned red, and she lowered her head, tears streaming down, as if she had suffered a great grievance. Watching them act in sync, the fire in my heart grew bigger and bigger. I broke free from David Lee's grasp and sneered. Fine, she's not wrong, you're not wrong, none of you are wrong, it's all my fault. I tired her out by bringing friends home. I'm really too much. I'll leave, okay? I'll entertain my friends outside, alright? I ranted, ignoring David Lee and Emily Song's reactions, grabbed my suitcase, and left. If I stayed in the same room with these two any longer, I might really go crazy. I needed to find a place to calm down and carefully plan my future. This petty revenge against Emily Song was just the beginning. I would make David Lee pay for his betrayal too. It turned out that leaving home was a very wise decision. Staying at home and constantly having to deal with those two people was nothing compared to the freedom I have now. I booked the most expensive suite in a 5-star hotel. Every day after work, I would wander around the mall, buying whatever I liked with my credit card. This card holds all the money that David Lee and I have earned over the years. I trusted David Lee completely, and he made a lot more money than he spent. I never thought that some of his expenses were to support another woman. Now, I am determined to spend every last cent on this card. Anyway, we will have to divide the assets after the divorce, so I might as well spend more before the divorce is finalized. David Lee kept sending me messages on WeChat and even tried calling me, but I blocked him. I just wanted a few more days of peace. A few days later, I ran into David Lee waiting for me after work outside the office. He was dressed in a suit, holding a bouquet of my favorite champagne roses, making him very conspicuous. My colleagues teased me with smiles. "Your husband is here to pick you up again. Even after all these years, he still surprises you." "Yeah, you are really enviable. Your husband is both handsome and caring." To be honest, David Lee is indeed quite good-looking and has always been very considerate towards me. I have always been seen as the lucky one with the perfect partner. Even I firmly believed it myself. But the more beautiful something appears on the outside, the more chilling it is on the inside. I said goodbye to my colleagues and David Lee walked over with the flowers. He smiled ingratiatingly. "Wife, I'm sorry. Please don't be mad anymore. Dad heard that I made you angry and came home to scold me for half a day. He said if I don't bring you back, I shouldn't think about coming home either. Please, wife, forgive me this one last time and come home with me. Dad is still waiting for us to have dinner together." He was apologizing, but not mentioning anything about firing Emily Song, clearly avoiding the important issue. I knew exactly what was going on in my mind. But I still went along with the opportunity he provided and agreed to go home with him. I indeed had something to discuss with my dear father-in-law. 6. Initially, according to David Lee's description, his father had received a critical condition notice and his life was in danger at any moment. I was consumed with guilt because I was away on a business trip and couldn't rush back. But after we adopted the child, my father-in-law miraculously recovered and quickly regained his health. I truly believed it was a miracle and was genuinely happy for David Lee. Because my parents passed away early, I understand the pain of losing a loved one, and I didn't want David Lee to suffer the same fate. But now I understand. This was clearly all a play deliberately staged by David Lee and his family, just waiting for me to fall into the trap. That father-in-law who was usually polite to me was definitely not unaware. He was David Lee and Emily Song's accomplice. Back home, David Lee's father, John Lee, was extremely enthusiastic towards me, occasionally scolding David Lee for being inconsiderate, completely on my side. Even the dishes on the table were all my favorites. I feigned a smile, but my heart remained unmoved. The better this family treated me, the less they saw me as a human being. During dinner, I suddenly suggested sending my father-in-law back to the private nursing home. After John Lee recovered, I was worried that something might happen to him living alone after being discharged from the hospital, so I found a private nursing home with a good environment and excellent service for him. John Lee was flattered, but verbally refused. Dad has never lived a life of luxury, and now at this age, there's no need to waste that money. Seemingly a refusal, but every word was playing the victim. John Lee had experienced the comfortable days in the private nursing home, so of course he wouldn't want to leave. I played along. "How can you say that? Winja and I earn money so that you and the children can have a better life. Besides, it's time for you to enjoy life." Finally, after much persuasion, John Lee reluctantly agreed. "Xiao-yi, since you've said so, Dad can't refuse. It's just troubling you to spend the money." I smiled nonchalantly, "As long as Dad is comfortable. As for the expense, your son can afford to support a daughter outside, so he certainly won't mind spending some money on his own father. In a private nursing home, high-quality service and environment are bought with money, and the daily expenses can reach 4 figures. The last time John Lee was in the nursing home, I was afraid he would feel bad about the money, so I paid for it with the money my parents left me. Even David Lee didn't know how expensive it was to stay there for a day. Listening to our conversation, David Lee kept piling food onto my plate. "Wife, you're so kind. Even though I made you so angry, you're still so considerate of Dad." I calmly pushed the food he gave me to the side, with a caring smile on my face. "It's nothing, it's not worth mentioning. After all, it won't be my money being spent this time. Ever since I came back, I've been spending lavishly every day." David Lee had no complaints and was even grateful to me. Because I wasn't just spending on myself, I was generously spending on everyone. I bought a range of insurances for the kids, including education, critical illness, and accident insurances. I got David Lee brand name belts and ties and bought his dad all sorts of fancy but worthless gift boxes of supplements. Of course, I wasn't foolish enough to repay evil with kindness. A little more attention would reveal that everything I bought for them was expensive and depreciated quickly, losing value the moment the money was spent. Before long, David Lee's salary card was nearly maxed out by my spending. By the time David Lee realized what had happened, I was ready with the divorce papers. When he got home from work, he didn't even have time to change his shoes before anxiously asking me why there was no money left in the account. The things I bought for you, and the daily expenses for the kids and dad, do you think they were blown here by the wind? Don't they all cost money? David Lee muttered in disbelief, did you use all the money from that card? I calmly responded, is there a problem with that? That account had my salary too, and anyway, I was spending money on you, Dad, and the kids. Why shouldn't I use it? Wife, I'm not blaming you, David Lee said, his face ashen as he sat on the sofa. The economy is down, and our company is cutting jobs. I have a good relationship with the manager, so I thought I could buy some gifts to bribe him. Suddenly, he seemed to remember something and became excited. Your father had some connections with our boss, right? Wife, you could talk to our boss and put in a good word for me. David Lee's calculations were very clear. Indeed, their boss had a good relationship with my father. When my father was alive, their boss often came to our house. Whenever I was there, I would always try to make David Lee more noticeable to their boss, hoping it would help his career. In the end, my heartfelt efforts were repaid with a slap in the face. Now I couldn't wait for him to lose his job. Since my dad passed away, I haven't seen your boss. He probably doesn't even recognize me now. If I suddenly approach him, it might backfire and ruin your job. You have a point, David Lee pondered for a moment, then looked at me with hope again. Wife, you must still have money. Didn't your parents leave you a large inheritance? You'll definitely help me, right? David Lee was convinced I would help him, his expression relaxed. Of course, I'll help you, I said, fiddling with my fingers in mock distress. I just don't know what interest rate to charge. David Lee laughed, stood up, and tried to pull me into his arms. Wife, you're joking with me. There's no need to talk about interest rates within a family. Once I save my job, I'll give you all my salary. I avoided his embrace with disgust and handed him the prepared divorce papers. A family? We won't be one for long. David Lee's face changed instantly when he saw the document. Wife, this joke is too much. I showed him the signed page. I've never been more serious. David Lee stared at the page in a daze for a long time. You really want to divorce me? He looked up at me sharply, his eyes filled with anger and shock. Because of that incident? Didn't I apologize to you? Grace Shin, when did you become so unreasonable? It turns out that when hatred accumulates to a certain point, it becomes numb. When it was finally time to confront David Lee, I was surprisingly calm. I threw the paternity test in front of him and looked at him emotionlessly. When you did those things, did you ever think of us as a family? David Lee's face turned pale. You know? I finally asked the question that had puzzled me for a long time. What did I do to deserve this from you? David Lee avoided my gaze and remained silent. I continued, or let me ask another way, did you ever really love me? Something in my words seemed to provoke David Lee. He suddenly grabbed my wrist, his eyes bloodshot. Of course I love you. I put in so much effort to marry you. How could I not love you? You worked hard to marry me, and then what? Then you continued to have another woman outside and made me raise her child. If this is David Lee's so-called love, I'd rather not have it. Wife, please, forgive me this once, okay? You can hit me or scold me, but please don't mention divorce. David Lee cried, clutching my sleeve and begging for my forgiveness. Looking at his pathetic state, I felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. I had my hand back, not wanting to waste any more time with David Lee. I'll see you in court. I officially started divorce proceedings against David Lee. During this period, David Lee came to me with his father, trying to win my forgiveness. I called the police right in front of them. David Lee couldn't believe that I could be so ruthless. Grace Shin, I never truly saw you for who you are. You're this heartless. When John Lee heard the police were coming, he hurriedly dragged David Lee away. At this point, he finally tore off his mask of being a good father-in-law, viciously calling me a hen that doesn't lay eggs. My son never minded that you couldn't have children. Not only are you ungrateful, but now you even want a divorce. Fine, you want a divorce, right? My son can't have wasted all these years with you for nothing. Your parents left you a lot of money. If you divorce, at least half of it should go to my son. I ignored their words, focusing solely on the divorce process. Everything proceeded smoothly. David Lee was at fault. After all, he was the one who personally handed me the evidence of his infidelity. I demanded the house and generously agreed to split the marital assets. The nearly depleted salary account I gave entirely to David Lee without a care. As for the inheritance my parents left me, they had gifted it to me and taken me to the notary office for certification. David Lee wouldn't get a single cent. Walking out of the courthouse, David Lee suddenly seemed to realize. You did it on purpose, didn't you? You intentionally spent all the money. I looked at him calmly, not denying it at all. David Lee, you have to pay for everything you've done. Moreover, compared to the harm you caused me, this is nothing. John Lee, seeing that his son couldn't get a penny from me, was furious. You wretched woman, you can't have children, but you have plenty of schemes. No wonder your parents died early. They couldn't wait to get the inheritance certified. They deserved to die quickly. To me, they were nothing more than ridiculous clowns now. I looked at John Lee with a threatening expression, gesturing towards the courthouse behind me. I advise you to watch your mouth unless you want to end up in here again. After the divorce, I sold that unlucky house. Coincidentally, the company intended to transfer me to a managerial position at a branch office. My boss asked if I minded moving to another city. I couldn't have been more eager and agreed immediately. Before leaving this city filled with unpleasant memories, I visited a local hospital. John Lee was hospitalized there, a fact I learned from a mutual friend of David Lee. John Lee had enjoyed a long stay at a private sanatorium without any illness, but now that he was genuinely sick, not only did he lose the good medical environment, David Lee had to scrape together the medical expenses from various sources. The table beside John Lee's bed was filled with numerous supplements, all exquisitely packaged and expensive. I recognized them as the ones I had once bought for John Lee. These items had no real nutritional value, they were just sold on hype. Seeing me, John Lee's clouded eyes widened a bit. He was paralyzed from the waist down because of a stroke, and his spirit was completely gone, a far cry from his once arrogant and domineering self when he used to berate me. John Lee couldn't form complete sentences yet, his mouth trembling constantly, probably cursing me in his mind. I ignored his glaring eyes and walked to his bedside. Did Emily Song run away with the child? John Lee froze upon hearing this, just furrowing his brows at me, probably wondering how I knew. I continued, she came to see me, and she brought your precious grandson. A week ago, Emily Song found me, crying and begging me to help her for the sake of the child. Not long after my divorce from David Lee, he became part of the company's layoff. Without a job or savings, his life quickly became difficult. David Lee submitted several resumes without success and then turned to drinking. Emily Song rolled up her sleeves to reveal bruises, crying to me, he starts beating me whenever he's drunk. If I stay with him any longer, he'll beat me to death. And now he not only can't make money but also takes all of mine. The child and I are penniless and have been starving for days. Miss Shin, I know you are kind-hearted, please save me and the child. Emily Song sobbed uncontrollably, but I couldn't muster any sympathy. Back then, she had also cried like this, accusing me of bullying her in front of David Lee. I couldn't even fathom how she had the nerve to come to me, holding her child, to complain about David Lee's abuse. But in the end, I gave her some money. Of course, this money wasn't given for free, I exchanged it for the right to rename her child. That's why I could now stand by John Lee's bed and announce word by word. That grandson you worked so hard to get, the one you proudly consider the Lee family's bloodline, no longer bears the Lee surname. He now bears the surname Shin, just like me, whom you despise so much. As soon as I finished speaking, John Lee started wailing in distress. I struck him right in his heart, knowing it would hurt him deeply. I originally didn't want to have any more ties with you, but you had to insult my parents, so I can't let this go. John Lee's eyes were filled with venomous hatred, but I was no longer afraid of him. His life was destined to be wasted in bed until he died with his eyes open in anger. I walked out of the hospital and ran into David Lee, who was just about to go in. In less than a month, he had become a shadow of his former self. The once clean-shaven face was now covered in messy stubble, dark circles under his eyes, and his entire face was puffy from excessive drinking. He was still dressed in the branded clothes I had intentionally bought for him. Now he couldn't sell them, so he had no choice but to wear them himself. These expensive clothes looked cheap and degraded on him now. I could no longer reconcile this disheveled and pathetic David Lee with the man I once deeply loved. But I guess he really was no longer the confident and spirited person I remembered. David Lee had left the version of himself that loved me in the past, and now, he would betray me without hesitation. I walked past him without a glance, as if I hadn't seen him at all. Betrayers will gradually be erased from my world by the passage of time. And my world will still be filled with flowers, fragrant all the way through. David Lee's perspective. After the divorce, I encountered Grace Shin again. Seeing her come out of the hospital, I instinctively lowered my head to avoid her. I knew how pathetic I looked now, even I couldn't help but feel disgusted. After the divorce, my life took a downward spiral. My father fell gravely ill, and I faced setbacks at work. The harsh realities led me to seek solace in alcohol. I drank day and night, passing out in my bedroom, only to wake up with a splitting headache against the cold toilet. In those moments, I would instinctively call out, "Wife," but no matter how hoarse my voice became, no one would respond. I stared blankly at the yellowed, damp floor, suddenly realizing this was no longer the clean, tidy, and lively home I once had. The wife who would, while grumbling, always prepare sobering soup for me no matter how late it was, would never appear again. The emptiness after the alcohol faded was almost unbearable. With red eyes, I staggered to my feet, looking at my reflection in the mirror, neither human nor ghost. I frantically smashed the broken mirror. As if by doing so, I could still be my former glorious self. As if Grace Shin would still be my wife. But reality wouldn't allow me to deceive myself. My hand was cut and bleeding from the shattered mirror, and all I could hear were the frightened cries of Emily Song and her child. Everything was a complete mess. I was engulfed in profound pain until a familiar fragrance wafted by. Instinctively, I looked up to see Grace Shin walking past me. She didn't even glance at me, treating me like a stranger. I couldn't help but turn to look at her. She was still the same. From the first time I met her until now, she had always been like this. Still beautiful, confident, and the natural focus of any crowd. I recalled her asking me if I ever loved her. How could I not love her? I was deeply captivated by her from the moment I first saw her. To win her over, I learned all her interests and hobbies. To gain her parents' approval, I worked tirelessly. I even secretly rejoiced when she told me she couldn't have children. Because of this, I had significantly fewer competitors. I sincerely believed that none of this mattered. As long as Grace Shin could marry me, what did it matter if we never had children? Until my father coldly questioned me. If you love her so much, what about her? Does she love you? She won't even give you a child. How could she possibly love you? That remark felt like a thorn piercing my heart. My mother died giving birth to me due to complications. My father had told me countless times that it was because my mother loved him so deeply that she sacrificed her life to give him a child. I couldn't help but wonder if Grace Shin ever loved me. I was so deeply troubled by this that when my father introduced me to Emily Song, I didn't refuse. But I swore I never intended to divorce Grace Shin. Even when Emily Song bore me a child, I only thought of giving the child to Grace-shin to raise. Because as long as I saw Grace-shin treating the child well, I could convince myself that she loved me. But I couldn't understand why it ended up this way. I just wanted a child to prove that Grace-shin loved me. What did I do wrong? I pondered this question in despair as I watched Grace-shin's receding figure. Grace-shin had walked far away. And I could only remain where I was, eternally tormented by the question of whether Grace-shin ever loved me.